In my studies, I realized there is so much information that the church does not know, they're not aware of as it pertains to the Bible. We need to know biblical culture. So today we're going to look at marriage and divorce based on the scriptures. Make sure you stay tuned.
You are listening to the Divorced Christian Podcast Show with your host and teacher, Darius Good. He is the senior pastor of Bible Gospel Center and founder of Good Treasure Ministries. He is the author of the books Unlocking Godly Wisdom and The Divorced Christian. For more information, visit the website at thedivorcedchristian.com. And now, here's your host, Darius Good.
Thank you for joining us on today. You're listening to the Divorced Christian Podcast Show. My name is Darius Good. I'm the senior pastor of Bible Gospel Center. Our church is located in Connecticut. We built this platform, this podcast show, for Christians who are divorced. There is so much misinformation, and I also believe disinformation, which is taught in church, which surrounds the subject of divorce. I began studying the subject of divorce in 2021 to understand it from a biblical standpoint. And there was so much information I began to uncover that I could not find through Christian teachings. But as I began to look at the law of Moses and talk to rabbis and read Jewish writings, it began to explain and open up to me how that system worked. And what I discovered was Jesus' teachings was based on this Jewish system. And as I've been highlighting Jewish culture, their laws and how those laws were enforced, has brought a tremendous understanding not only of the Old Testament scriptures, but the New Testament as well, as Jesus was a Jewish man talking to Jewish people who understood Jewish laws and customs, who also understood Jewish words, because we use definitions today that they did not use 5,000 years ago. And so I hope you stay tuned on today. I'm going to be reading from my book, The Loophole. This is my latest book that I put out in regards to this subject on divorce. Information for this book you can find in today's notes. Also, I have a brand new book entitled Marriage Pillars. In this book, we realize a lot of people are married that listen to our platform, and so this book will be helpful for you. Or if you're divorced and looking to remarry, I think this book will also be helpful for you as we identify 30 pillars in a marriage that are critical to having a healthy, strong, fulfilling relationship. So check that book out when you get a chance. If you click on the link, the first 6 chapters of that book, you can read for free in a PDF right there on the website. So once again, all that information is right in today's subject notes. If you're listening by radio, thank you for joining us. If you're listening on the podcast show, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. We're going to teach today from my book, The Loophole. The book, The Loophole, actually explains why Jesus was teaching on adulterous marriages. So 2 things that the church always gets wrong. We do not have the definition of an adulterous marriage is not the definition that they used in Israel. And the reason why Jesus was then addressing adulterous marriages, Christians don't know. They don't know the history. They don't know the trending behaviors that was occurring during the time of Jesus. And it took a lot of research. It took me about 5 years to find out the answer to this question. But there were laws that were passed during the time of Jesus. And in this book, I explain what those laws were, why they were passed, and the reason this behavior was creating a influx of adulterous marriages there in Israel. So I encourage you to pick this book up. The book, actually, I think I posted the entire book. So if you check out the link, dariusgood.com / I think it's The Loophole, but you find the information here in the podcast show, in the notes. If you click on that link, you might be able to read that book in its entirety, but I'll prefer if you purchase it. Thank you. Let's jump into today's lesson. We're going to begin on page 38 of the book. In this chapter, I explain the laws of marriage. Now, I've been told by Christians there's no need to understand Jewish culture, Jewish law. It's not important. Jesus was putting laws in place. The problem with that teaching is the laws that Jesus was teaching, they weren't new laws. He was not putting laws in place. He was discussing Jewish law. And I have another book that I wrote entitled The Sermon on the Mount. in which I discuss these laws. Every law that Jesus stated is in the Jewish law, in the Torah, and I explain what the repercussions of every law was. I was able to find every statement Jesus made and where it's actually in the law of Moses. So because of that, no, Jesus was not establishing new laws. So we can't just take Jewish laws and customs and throw it aside, because in order for us to understand what Jesus was teaching and what he was saying and explaining, we need to understand Jewish customs and Jewish laws. And so here's the other major issue is, as we're going to see it today, as we talk about Jewish marriage, this is what Christianity is established on. Jesus took the Jewish system of marriage and it became the outline for our relationship with him. It's the current state or stage in which the church is in. So if we don't understand this, we don't understand Christianity at all. And so there's a massive disconnect between what I'm hearing taught in church and what aligns between Old Testament and New Testament. They're not contrary. There is an alignment. I've heard since I was a child how Christianity is built on Judaism, and then all the teachings I hear are contrary to Judaism. But they're not. If one is built on the other, there are many areas where the two align. And so let's begin on page 38. It's entitled The Laws of Marriage. And I explain, to understand divorce within Israel, we must first understand the Jewish marriage process. Now, this is important because Jewish marriage requires a prenup. And this is one of the areas I had never heard taught in church, never heard explained. Every marriage required a prenup, and they don't use the term prenup. But when I remember hearing this when I first heard this information, I was taken aback. Because in Christianity, we don't discuss divorce. Divorce is not an option. Divorce is a sin. But then why in Judaism, why in the Jewish faith, the Jewish culture, was every marriage required to have a prenup in place? And so there was not an expectation, but there was a thought out plan of what would happen if this does not work. Now, this is not in this particular chapter, but it's important that we know this before we read this chapter. Before these couples got married, they live in a culture where they do not touch each other. So they have a law in place called the law of touch, and they have a law called the law of seclusion. And both of these I explain in the book, The Loophole. So we'll eventually get to this. But those laws basically state that you do not touch women you're not married to. So men in their culture are celebrated not by the number of women they've been involved with. Their ability to have one relationship with one marriage, that's a sign of strength. In one of the writings that I read, if a man became betrothed to a woman and she ends up getting pregnant during the betrothal period, that man was shamed and he was viewed as being weak, his inability to wait until being married. That's a very different culture than American culture, and a very different culture than what I've seen in church. Even when we've promoted, purity culture, which is not biblical. It's not based on scriptures. They took scriptures to kind of build this system. But when it's devoid of these sort of laws, these sort of culture that's built into the community that says we do not touch our women until married, that's not American culture. So this is why the purity movement has failed. It didn't work because you're trying to take bits and pieces of what we're seeing in the scripture and apply it to church community, church culture, but that's not what the foundation of our society. In Jewish society, in Hebrew society, they did not touch women they weren't married to. And one reason is they always viewed women as being unclean. And so they wouldn't go bathe in the mikveh, which produces spiritual cleansing until the woman became betrothed, until the woman was married. So any woman that was not betrothed, they viewed as being unclean. And if I touch her, I would then be defiled. This is built into their society. And this is not what's a part of Christian culture. So in our culture, men sleep around, and then we got to figure out how to now remain monogamous. Women sleep around and now got to figure out how to be monogamous in their marriage. So it doesn't work. And that's why I'm highlighting these laws, the laws of seclusion, the laws of touch, and just do a Google search. Type in explain what is the Jewish law regarding the laws of touch or the Jewish law regarding the laws of seclusion. Even today in Jewish communities, you do not see them do physical displays of affection, public displays of affection. All that's a part of their culture, and there's a deeper reason why. It's not that we just don't touch our wives in public, but it goes back to the laws of purity. And so it's a much different society, and the reason it works is because it's embedded in their society versus what Christianity is trying to do. Christianity is trying to take bits and pieces of what we're seeing in the scripture, apply it to our churches, and it doesn't work because that's not our society. So as we're looking at this, the prenup was a requirement for every marriage. So marriage required a form of prenup, and this was a part of the marriage contract, the Jewish marriage contract, which is called the ketubah. That's the Hebrew word, Ketubah. Please look these words up, and you will see that it basically explains it's a prenup. Every Jewish woman was required to have a ketubah before she could enter into marriage. Now, there's also, I don't go through the great detail, every woman in Israel did not have a ketubah. So this is where you have to understand the culture. And you may want to do your own research on that, which women did not have ketubahs and which ones were required to have one. But every Jewish woman or Hebrew woman had to have a ketubah in order to marry. I think slaves, and there might be other categories that weren't required to have a ketubah. Now, why is this important? Because as Christians, why is this important? Because Christian doctrine draws symbolic meaning from the structure of Jewish marriage, especially in reference to the relationship between Christ and the church. So there are 3 stages of marriage in the Jewish structure. There are 3 distinct stages. The first is the shidduchan. This word is shidduchin. And this was the promise or the arrangement for marriage. And so at this point, there's a promise that's been made, but they're not required to be betrothed. It's just a promise. The second stage was the kiddushin, Kiddushin. This is when the couple enters into a legal betrothal. Legal betrothal. This is not an engagement. So they are very different. It's a massive difference between a betrothal and what the American culture calls an engagement. And then we'll get into this, but as you know, in order to break off a betrothal, you have to get divorced. So clearly, there's a legal status involved and legal steps that are required, which we don't do in America. I don't fill out paperwork to get engaged to my wife. I make the promise to her. You give her a ring, a token, and that she receives, in essence, as her yes. But there's no paperwork that we fill out to change her legal status. The third stage is the nisuin, Nisuin. And this is now the final stage, which is the full-fledged marriage. So these are your 3 stages: the shidduchan, the kiddushin, and the nisuin. And I may not be pronouncing these correctly because I don't speak Hebrew. Let's deal with the promise, the shidduchan. Now, the shidduchan refers to the initial arrangements before the legal betrothal. It was a mutual promise between a man and a woman to contract a marriage in the future. Understand, I said contract a marriage. This agreement could be made directly by the individuals or arranged by their parents or relatives on their behalf. However, this stage did not legally change the couple's status. Contrary to popular belief, a woman's consent was required. And I'm highlighting this because Christian preachers and teachers often say women could not consent to marriage. It was all arranged. How is that true? If we're married to Christ, your marriage to Christ was not arranged. We're following the Jewish system. So that's not true. The woman's consent was required. So she could not be given in marriage without her consent. Jewish tradition upheld the principle of mutual consent. Rabbis teach mutual consent, and this concept is supported by Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, which deals with the case of a man having relations with a woman not betrothed. Now, this is very important as I began to give you Jewish thought and Jewish explanation. You cannot read the scriptures and say, well, I don't see it that way. It's not, the scriptures are not written to a generation that's living in 2026 in America. It's based on their era, their time, their laws, their tradition, how they see it. And this is how they took these scriptures and implemented them into their culture. So it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. So in this case, in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, you have this woman that's not betrothed. A man has relations with her. And in this case, the rabbis explained that the consent is implied. It's implied. So they're not questioning whether consent was involved, that the woman was just taken by force. But it's also made clear that the law now states the man loses his right to divorce the woman if the father gives consent to the marriage. So there's a lot here in this statement because the father did not and was not required to give consent to the marriage just because they had relation. And so if you go to Exodus chapter 22, verse 17, you will see this other extension of the law where the father is required to give consent. So as far as the woman giving consent to enter into a relationship, if you go back to Genesis chapter 24, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. And some teach that Rebekah's consent to marry Isaac was the exception, that this was not the norm. That's not true. It was the norm. And if you realize it, when Rebekah and her family were approached, what's often missed is the cultural significance of the gifts that were given to her. She received the gift. So if you go to Genesis chapter 24, verses 22, I'm going to read it from the NIV version. It says that the camel had finished drinking. The man took out a golden nose ring weighing a beka and 2 golden bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Now, if you read this in the King James Version, it says that it was an earring upon her face. So the Hebrew and the NIV states it was a nose ring, a customary betrothal gift in ancient Middle Eastern tradition. We cannot throw out these traditions and rewrite the story. And it's funny because I would highlight to my mother that they wore nose rings, and my mother would get upset because she felt that women shouldn't wear nose rings. I was like, that was normal. And it was a sign that this woman was either betrothed or married. So let's keep going. Rebekah and her family were approached, but what's often missed is the cultural significance of the gift that was received. Biblical scholars often refer to Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 12, as a confirmation of this symbolism. Importantly, Rebekah gave her consent. She understood that receiving the nose ring meant that she was entering into a betrothal. Moses later made it law that daughters of Israel could not be married without their agreement. This is an article. It's from the website chabad.org, chabad.org. The article is entitled "The Jewish Betrothal, Kiddushin, Way in Love, and Marriage" by Maurice Lamb, L-A-M-M, or Lame, L-A-M-M. I quoted from this article that in Jewish law, taking a wife can never mean taking by force. The Talmud explanation on this, it references Genesis chapter 24, verses 58. And this is the relationship or the betrothal offer made to Rebekah by Abraham's servant. So the Talmud aligns with these teachings. All these is a part of Jewish thought, Jewish customs. They reference Genesis 24, verses 58, where Rebekah is asked directly whether she will go with Abraham's servant. Lame notes that for marriage, the law requires dat, D-A-A-T, which is a Hebrew word, which means willing consent, as opposed to the Hebrew word H-A-S-K-A-M-A-H, which means to be taken by force. So it's important we understand the Hebrew words. The word consent has two different definitions. So one means willing consent. The other one does not mean willing consent. Now, he further explains that the ring presented must have an easily determined value. If a woman was deceived, for example, believing that a custom ring was in fact a diamond ring, she could legally rescind the marriage as her consent would not have been informed or willing. Why did I highlight this in my writings? Because the woman had the right to rescind the marriage. I'm telling you, a lot of what we've been taught, a lot of what's been explained to us in church is very inaccurate. So this is part of the promise that was made. We have a few minutes. Let's get into the Kiddushin, which is the betrothal. Now, in the Kiddushin, this is the stage commonly translated as betrothal, though it is much more serious than the modern engagement. In Jewish law, which they reference, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, it refers to this particular stage of the marriage. So where it reads, when a man hath taken a wife, the next statement says, and married her. So the taking of the wife, they refer to as the betrothal stage. So at this point, the couple is required to sign the ketubah. The ketubah is the legally binding marriage contract. The ketubah outlined the man's responsibilities to the woman, including her dowry and a guaranteed sum she would receive in the event of the death or divorce. So if the man was to die or divorce her, there was a guaranteed amount of money that would go to the woman. So it's basically a life insurance policy or a prenuptial agreement for the woman. I also want to highlight that the dowry was very important because the dowry was the woman's inheritance. So the eldest son got a double portion. The sons were required to get a portion. And they say the woman got nothing. That is not true. She received her dowry, which was to be returned to her in the case of a divorce. So it's interesting. All these pieces are in place for divorce. Not encouraging it, but being prepared for it. Now, once the ketubah was signed, the couple was considered legally married, though they had not yet consummated the marriage. A betrothal ceremony called a Erusin, E-R-U-S-I-N, followed. So once they signed the contract, they then have this week-long betrothal ceremony. As part of the preparation, both the man and the woman were bathed in the mikveh, the ritual cleansing that symbolizes spiritual purification before entering their covenant. The ceremony began with a blessing over the wine, followed by the rabbi reciting the betrothal blessing. Next, the extension of the incest laws to include a mate's relatives was now read. And this is based on Leviticus chapter 18 and 19. And this made it clear that both partners in laws were now considered off limits. You cannot marry them. Why is this important? This was the issue that we found during Jesus' time when John the Baptist was telling Herod, you can't be married to your brother's wife. All these laws were pronounced during the betrothal. So now, even if you do end up divorced, these people are now off limits to you to marry. I'm telling you, the whole story fits together. New Testament, Old Testament, it all fits together. We're going to stop here on today. We're now on page 40 of my book. Check it out. All the links are in today's notes. If you're listening by radio, join us again, same time on next week. Remember to like, share. Please share these with people that need to hear these teachings. And until next time, be blessed.
You've been listening to the Divorced Christian Podcast Show with your host, Darius Good. This was a Good Treasure Ministries production. Darius is the senior pastor of Bible Gospel Center, and he is the author of the book, The Divorced Christian. To learn more about this book and other books written by Darius, or to listen to other episodes of our podcast show, visit our website today at thedivorcedchristian.com. We pray that today's episode has brought revelation, understanding, and healing. Please like, share, and subscribe to our podcast show. And until next time, be blessed.